We begin with President Obama making history in Prague, signing on to a landmark agreement with Russian President Dmitry Medvedev to dramatically cut both countries' nuclear arsenals. The treaty the two presidents signed today commits both us and Russia to cutting the number of nuclear warheads by a third. It's the biggest nuclear arms treaty in a generation. For President Obama, it's also a major component of what he appears to want to be his signature foreign policy accomplishment, the reduction of the nuclear threat to both the United States and the world. The Cold War is over. The threat now is nuclear terrorism and rogue states, and recognizing and neutralizing that threat has been Barack Obama's passion since his time in the Senate. Now, as president, he's prioritizing it. Meanwhile, as the president was taking on that heavy task on the world stage today, the opposition party back here at home is trying to figure out who will lead them in the next election against President Obama. Today was day one of the Southern Republican Leadership Conference, this year being held in New Orleans. It's an all-weekend-long affair running through Sunday. It's being billed as the most prominent Republican event until the 2012 convention. Addressing the event on opening night were former Republican House Speaker Newt Gingrich and Pressure Group founder and daughter of a former Vice President, Liz Cheney. Before the weekend's over, attendees will get the chance to hear speeches from almost every Republican who's ever been mentioned even once about maybe running for the Republican nomination in 2012, including Sarah Palin and Louisiana Governor Bobby Jindal and Texas Governor Rick G. Your hair smells terrific Perry, Texas Congressman Ron Paul, Minnesota Governor Tim Pawlenty, lots of them. Of course, RNC Chairman Michael Steele is also scheduled to speak. Everybody very much looking forward to that. And also, of course, there's a Sean Hannity book signing. Wouldn't be complete without it. But while the foreign policy work of the presidency and the political work of those who would hope to take over the presidency in the next election proceeds apace, today's headlines are a reminder that news does not always fit well onto the political axis. Last night, if you watched the second edition of this show, which airs at 11 p.m. Eastern Time, you would have seen a very different show than our first run, which aired at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And that's because at roughly 10 o'clock, as soon as we finished the first edition of our show, news broke of a disturbance on board an airplane bound from Washington, D.C. to Denver. For that first hour or so after the news broke, the story had a lot of worrying components. Early reporting was that a man from Qatar, a diplomat from Qatar's embassy in Washington, had reportedly tried to light an explosive device from inside the plane's bathroom while it was in the air, and that man was then subdued by at least one U.S. air marshal. Now, before midnight, most of that had been dialed back, and we were left with a much less dramatic, much less dire portrait of what had actually happened on board that plane. The diplomat from Qatar had not been trying to light an explosive device. He didn't have an explosive device. There was no explosive device on the plane. He was, however, apparently smoking in the plane's bathroom. He subsequently was involved in some sort of confrontation with a U.S. air marshal on board the plane. That resulted in the scene we saw last night, the plane having been escorted to the ground by F-16 fighter jets, sequestered on a runway, surrounded by emergency vehicles at Denver International Airport. By the time today's news cycle came around, the story was not only not as worrying anymore, it was almost the subject of ridicule.
When all is said and done, authorities look at this as just a phenomenal act of stupidity.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it, Harry. I talked to a number of top officials last night. Nobody was laughing at this joke.
It's unclear whether or not he was joking or if there was a possible language barrier.
By the way, that's an unfortunate language barrier, if in fact that was the case.
Even more unfortunate joke.
Wait, just ask for a little bitty fine so that people like me are deterred from smoking in the bathroom. And then, you know, when I open the door and I say, my foot was hot, and they, you know.
It was almost a punchline today, which was pretty much warranted by the way the news turned after those initial scary reports. Then there were further new developments today. We learned why this diplomat from Qatar was going to Denver in the first place. He was going to Denver to meet with a man named Ali Al-Mari. Mr. Al-Mari is also from Qatar. Who is Al-Mari? Why is this name ringing a bell for you? It's because Mr. al-Mahri was arrested in 2001. He was ultimately declared by the United States to be an enemy combatant. He was held without charges for more than 5 years before eventually being moved into the criminal justice system and pleading guilty to terrorism charges last year. Mr. al-Mahri is now being held at the Supermax prison in Florence, Colorado. Now, the Qatari diplomat from last night's smoking in the bathroom incident was scheduled to meet with Mr. al-Mahri in prison at 11 a.m. today. Now, there's no reason to suspect that that meeting was anything other than what it was billed as. If you are an American arrested and imprisoned overseas, under the Geneva Conventions, officials from an American consulate get to visit you. And likewise, if you are a foreign citizen arrested and jailed in the U.S., consular officials from your country get to visit you here. Mr. al-Mahri specifically has been getting visits from Qatari consular officials since the middle of last year. Nevertheless, cue the political freakout in 4, 3, 2... Yeah. Joining us now is Charles Swift. Mr. Swift is a former judge, advocate general, and lieutenant commander in the United States Navy. He represented Salim Hamdan in the historic U.S. Supreme Court case, Hamdan versus Rumsfeld. Mr. Swift, thank you so much for being here. Appreciate your time tonight, sir.
I'm really glad to join you, Rachel.
In terms of what I said about the consular visits, as I mentioned, this Qatari diplomat on his way to visit Mr. al-Mahri at the Supermax prison in Colorado. Do all foreign-born prisoners in this country have the right to consular visits? Is that true everywhere?
That is true. You got one thing wrong. You had the wrong treaty. It's not the Geneva Conventions. It's the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations that permits the visits. But it's also a treaty that's been signed by the United States and ratified by the Senate. And yes, all foreign nationals, it's not foreign-born, it's whether you're a citizen of a foreign country.
Do you agree with my characterization, although I apologize for mentioning the wrong convention? Do you agree with the characterization that they are essentially normal, regular, routine? This is not something that should jump out as any sort of red flag because he was getting these visits?
It's absolutely normal, and the right has been absolutely recognized by the Supreme Court in several fairly historic cases in the last decade. And those visits go on around the United States every day. They also go on around the world where we visit our citizens with our consular officers.
One Republican congressman today suggested that Qatar pay the United States back for the trouble that was caused by the actions of this diplomat on this plane and the reaction to him. How are these things normally handled? Is there an accepted protocol, an international protocol for dealing with incidents like this?
Presuming, and I would assume he does, have diplomatic immunity, normally there's not a payback. What happened is the individual is recalled to their country. Qatar is embarrassed. He goes home, but under diplomatic relations around the world, we give our diplomats receive immunity from prosecution, and we give that same benefit to the diplomats that come to the United States. That's what happens.
Despite the rather routine nature of these arrangements, as you're describing it, today, just this afternoon, we're already seeing some sort of pundit quackery trying to cast the diplomatic visit itself as a red flag. Do you think that there is a distance between the politics and the justice issues here? Because broadly speaking, even people involved in politics don't really understand how detainees are treated, how prisoners are treated, how the justice system works.
And yes, absolutely. And this crank up of fear and other parts prevent the system from working. And it's been going on now since President Obama took office, is that this constant quackery on things that are very routine and law and the handling of situations, which have all been handled properly, is spun out of control. And it makes it impossible to do your job if the law and the methodologies in which we operate are constantly under attack. And we're not under attack, mind you. The procedures are under attack.
In terms of those procedures that you think are sort of unjustly under attack, would you include among them reading Miranda rights, for example, to people who are under arrest? I expect that we're going to get people attacking the idea of consular visits sometime soon. What else would you put in that list?
Oh, handling a criminal case in a criminal court, in federal court, trying terrorists in federal criminal courts when we've been extraordinarily successful, the intelligent methodologies that work. Instead, we argue for a lawless regime that has absolutely no history of being effective. And all of that comes out each time when one of these situations happens, and we make a mountain out of a molehill. And I think while it was stupid to smoke in a bathroom, what happens afterwards is extraordinarily absurd.
Charles Swift is a former Judge Advocate General, attorney, and a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy, represented Salim Hamdan in the landmark Supreme Court case Hamdan versus Rumsfeld. Mr. Swift, thank you very much for your time tonight. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome.